to Talking About Trauma. I'm your host, Dr. Kristina Wilkerson. During our program, we'll discuss the impact of interpersonal trauma, such as sexual and domestic violence. Interpersonal violence impacts us in various ways, as you'll hear today. It's a pervasive problem impacting the lives of women and men. Think about this. Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted, and every 73 seconds, a person is sexually assaulted. Every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. Our guests will share their stories about how they cope with remaining trauma from interpersonal violence. Later, we'll give you safety planning and support ideas for you to use or share. Joining me with their personal stories of violence survivors, allies, Zamar, Nia, and Joy. Welcome.
Hey.
Nia, let's start with you. What experience could you share with us?
Well, I've experienced both domestic and sexual violence. I experienced domestic violence from a family member while I was in middle school. At the time, I didn't realize that's what it was, but it was mainly verbal abuse, and it affected the whole house, and especially me because I was the oldest. And there was one time while I was babysitting that a family member decided to put abuse towards me, and I retaliated. And then when the other family member decided to come back, the first person that got in trouble was me, and I was then assaulted. And I was then assaulted, and the responsibility was taken out on me. And my experience with sexual violence happened when I was younger, and by a family member, and by a friend when I was older. Both were unexpected, and both has traumatically changed my outlook on a lot of different things.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that with us. It sounds like there's experiences that you've had with both of these forms of violence with people who were close to you. I'm wondering, Joy or Zamar, do you all have experiences where you were maybe impacted or someone else close to you was impacted by interpersonal violence?
Well, I haven't been the victim in any situation, but I always consider myself to be like an ally, just because growing up in my family, I can't think of one woman in my family who hasn't been a victim of domestic abuse. And one situation in particular, when I was younger, I had a family member whose house I would always go over for the weekend. And I was asleep and I woke up, and that family member and her child's father were arguing, and he was kind of threatening her. She's frightened, she's falling on the floor. He's threatening to hit her, and I'm watching the whole thing, and I'm a young kid, so I'm scared. I'm not brave enough to go step in and say something. So now as an adult, I could never see myself just stand back and watching and being on the sidelines in that situation. So now it's if I ever am near a situation like that, I kind of assess the situation. I'm not afraid to step in and say something to anybody. So
sure, no longer wanting to be a bystander.
Exactly.
Okay. Joy, what about you?
Growing up, I didn't see that in my household because I lived with my mom and my dad didn't live in the household with me. But as I got older, I kind of went through my own experience where somebody I least expected put their hands on me while I was pregnant. As I got older, spending more time with my family and learning more about my family, I learned that my grandmother was a victim of domestic abuse. And I learned just things that I didn't pay attention to when I was a child, or things that I was just unaware about or didn't know as a child that I learned growing into an adult and just becoming a woman. Just experienced some of the traumas that I have kind of changed my outlook on domestic violence and sexual violence.
Yeah. So I hear really what a lot of you are speaking to is that trend with family, friends, people that are close to us. Even myself as a professional, personally, I've gone through that as well. And then there's that, Nia, like what you said, just that idea of like, I don't know how to trust, right? I don't know, the dynamics of relationships kind of change. And as we've gotten older, kind of realizing that being that bystander is no longer something that we want to be. Speaking about it even now is something, although it may be challenging, is important for us to do, right? And so with that being said, why do we think that people are challenged with talking about this topic?
Because I didn't have that father figure to show me how it was supposed to go. I was very naive to even the fact that I needed to be heard. And I feel like a lot of times the abuse is such a norm that people don't feel like it's necessary to speak on it. And especially in the Black community, it is very taboo to go and search for help when there is difficulty with domestic violence or mental health or even sexual abuse. And it's a problem that rises in the Black community, and I feel like that's one of the things that should change, is to normalize not being okay.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we are expected to endure and suck it up, and it's just a part of life. And even though it is a part of life, it doesn't mean that it should just be looked over.
Any other thoughts about why we're challenged with this topic, why people are struggling to identify or talk about it?
I know for me, just even on last year, hearing about what my grandmother had endured back in the day, I think it's just challenging because you want better for your family or for the generation after you. So I think a lot of things are kept under wraps or swept under the rug because it's like, okay, that happened, but it doesn't have to continue, or that happened to me, it didn't happen to them, so they don't need to, they don't have to worry about that, they don't have to know about that. And I think that was what maybe was my father and my grandmother's way of thinking, like, you know, that she's a child, she doesn't need to know about that. Like, those are things that adults, like a lot of times in the Black community, we say, like, that's stay in a child's place, like you need to be in. And a lot of times, like, as adults, we don't share that transparent relationship with our children, like, this happened to me, but you know, it doesn't have to be that way for you, or this happened to such and such, but we're gonna do this differently so that, you know, this doesn't happen to you, or just these are the type of things that you're not supposed to do or that shouldn't be done. So I think that's the challenge of just being transparent, to where it's not airing out your business or even like downing the other person or the perpetrator, but just to let you know, like, these are the things that have taken place, and this is like it's almost like family history, like that happened back then, but this doesn't have to, it doesn't have to continue, the cycle doesn't have to repeat.
Yeah, that, because it does become historical trauma and generational trauma when those patterns continue. And I mean, you're saying, like, again, the thing that comes to mind when I hear both of you speak is that phrase that was in my family of children are seen and not heard.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's something else that has been indoctrinated in our community of, like, we children don't get to interrupt, they don't get to speak out on these things. And so breaking that cycle and educating ourselves and educating our children on this very topic is really essential, right?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what they were saying, it's I don't feel like, as like a society or community, that we make it comfortable enough for people to feel like they can say something is wrong. Like, if something happened, I think we're all kind of like in the mind state of, you know, traumatic things or just like big things like that couldn't happen to me. And when it does happen, you know, I'm embarrassed because it shouldn't have happened to me. But it's okay to not be okay. And I don't think enough people know that we do have people that we can go talk to, and you shouldn't feel like you can't talk about something.
Yeah. I think too, I mean, yeah, you mentioned something really interesting too, in that interpersonal violence can be not just the physical or sexual, but it can be emotional. You mentioned emotional, it can be financial. We're also in a time and age where stuff like stalking and trolling is very real, right? Social media has opened up a new platform for that. And so the idea that someone could specifically, that's unsolicited, like following you, trying to invoke fear, trying to manipulate someone, like that's a form of stalking. And even trolling is similar in that regard, in that the difference is you're using more of a virtual means of doing that, right? And we don't always think about this, but that offensive use of language or following someone online is another way that people are harassing and abusing people. And so interpersonal violence can impact us in various ways, as we're discussing. But there's also specific groups that are impacted more than others. I think we started to talk about race, right? And the fact that in certain racial minority groups that there are certain members that experience more risk. For example, members of the African American community, members of the LGBTQ plus community experience physical violence from an intimate partner more than potentially a heteronormative couple. Even individuals who identify as transgender are more likely to encounter public violence from their intimate partner. And so that to me is gut-wrenching, the idea that these people are seen publicly being abused. And so I kind of want to ask you all, what do you think the stigma around maybe gender, race, socioeconomic status when it comes to interpersonal violence? What do you think is at the root of that stigma?
Most people look at black men and feel like we're just aggressive, or we have to be hardworking, and we just have to be so macho like all the time. But anytime it's something outside of that, then we're looked at as like weak and just you're not manly, you're not being man enough. So it's kind of hard to like have someone to vent to or just to talk about certain things, whatever. So yeah, I feel like that definitely needs to change as far as like how we look at men or just how we look at people in general. Like we already have a stigma of what we think they should be like or what they should be doing or how they should be acting. And it's like people are people, and you know, everybody has their own emotions and feelings. So.
And I think when it comes to people feel pressured from trying to be something that they're not. And especially on social media, it being more seen for people to act like something that they're not, that can easily be carried into the home. And you can lose sense of who you are, and from both the victim and the perpetrator's point of view. So I think the stigma of trying to be something that they're not definitely plays into the role, because a lot of times there is trauma from the perpetrator, and then that's how they carry that on. Because I know from both of the perpetrators that that affected me, they either told me or I was able to see that they were affected somehow. And they continue to try to cover it up until it blows up. And it's a chain effect. And a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you're bringing up, Nia, too, because social media is this place where we get to put on the facade, right? And so in a sense, we don't always think about how that facade and the reinforcement that we get from social media can impact us in a positive or negative way. I know even in my experiences, I've had family members and friends from the LGBTQ plus community that have struggled with things like, this is not a heteronormative issue. This isn't just a man hitting a woman. Like, I'm a man dating a man and it happens in our relationships. I'm a woman dating a woman and it happens in our relationships. And the idea that these populations, these minority populations, these disenfranchised populations already are misunderstood, are already marginalized, and are in a space navigating where they don't feel safe. When their safety is compromised and they don't have a community that makes them feel safe or understood, it's even harder for them to reach out, right? And so again, what we're saying is really to take a second look at men, take a second look at people who may identify within the queer population, and even taking a look at social media and reading in between the lines, right? And so we're starting to speak to some things that I think would be an interesting segue. What needs to change, whether it be social media or, again, how we're interacting when it comes to interpersonal violence? What do we think needs to change?
Communication, I feel like, would make a difference. It won't save the world, but it's definitely a start.
Okay.
I think just realizing and just really sitting on the fact that everybody's human. Everybody has a feeling, whether it's right, wrong, good, bad. Like, everyone has a feeling inside of them. Everyone has a heart. You know, if they didn't have a heart, they wouldn't be living. And everyone's been, I always say, everyone has a story. It may not look like yours. It may not be black and white. It may not be as traumatic, but everyone has a story. Everyone has a place somewhere in this world, whether it's with a man, a woman, black, white, purple, yellow. Everyone has their own space. And I feel that realizing and knowing and then practicing that everyone is human, and then showing that respect, because a lot of times as a people we lack respect for one another because they're different from us. And granted, everyone's different, because if we were all the same, this world would be just bland. But just accepting the fact that everyone's different, everybody's human, everybody has feelings, and just relating to one another and just taking the time to get to know someone. You'd be surprised how many people you come across. If you just have a conversation, just say hello and just go from there. You realize, how similar but different you are from each other, and that's how you relate to each other on a daily.
I think as a whole, we just got to be better listeners. As with social media, like as soon as somebody says anything on social media, like everybody's first reaction is to say something about it and say like their first thought. And like the first thought is not always the best thought. So I feel like we just got to be better listeners. Like, if somebody feels comfortable enough to want to come out in a situation or speak about something that's like, painful for them to speak about, you don't have to say what you're thinking. You could just listen to them, because sometimes you listening is saying more than you actually responding or saying anything to it at all. Right. So I think we just got to be better listeners, and like you say, just allow humans to be human. A lot of times we get laughed at or made fun of, or just we get a lot of negative attention for having basic human emotions. And I don't understand like why it's that way now. It's like the world is a lot different than it was in 1950, 60, or even 2000. So, I think, like I said, we got to be better listeners, and we just have to allow other humans to be human.
Yeah. Well, I think what all of you are sharing is beautiful. I think about, as a clinician, one of the things I talk about in my sessions is a lot of us react, right? We're not listening, we're not communicating, we're not seeing or hearing each other as human beings, we're just reacting instead of reflecting and then responding, right? And so when we take time to kind of reflect and understand and educate ourselves, right? That's something that I find very, very important in the change of educating what abuse is, what it looks like, and that it can look different for everyone. And how a child may articulate that may look different than how a grown man may articulate that. And being able to have those conversations with whether it's a 5-year-old child or a 35, 65-year-old man or woman. So beautiful points of views here. I'm wondering, when it comes to that cycle of abuse, what do we think is needed to break that cycle? Because we talk about this a lot in interpersonal violence. So if the cycle is something that is continuing to happen, what do we think is key to breaking it?
I wouldn't even say looking at statistics, because I know a lot of times, like, people get intimidated by numbers, or they're just like, they're numbers. What does it mean to me? But just hearing those personal stories, like, of people, because I could look at you and you could have been, abused or had some type of, violence going on, and I would have never known that. But it's like, you wouldn't know that if you don't share those stories. You wouldn't know that just by looking, 35% of women. It's like, okay, well, how many women are we looking at? How many men are we looking at? Children, like, the numbers, they mean something, but they don't mean anything if there's not a story or anything given behind the number, because it's just a number. And a lot of people look at numbers like, okay, that doesn't affect me, but you could be sitting next to your counterpart and they could have been abused and you would have never known if you didn't share that story with them. So I think breaking the cycle is knowing that a person may or may not have a story, and it's up to you as the person that they're interacting with to make them feel comfortable enough to share that story and not ignore those feelings or disregard the emotions that they may have within sharing that story.
Yeah, building off of that, I think where everything comes to a standstill and why people have a problem like speaking out about it now is that people have different definitions when it comes to certain abuse. Like with verbal abuse, people think, oh, well, you'll be able to get over it, versus physical abuse, like, oh, yeah, that shouldn't have been done. Or when it comes to, especially when it comes to sexual abuse, there's the, oh, well, you shouldn't have been wearing that, or, well, what did you do to provoke it, or you should have just left type thing. And it's just being able to understand that other people have standards, different standards than you do. Something that might not have been as traumatic for me could have been extremely traumatic for you. And to be able to come to that middle ground and understand that not everybody's story is the same, kind of like what you were saying, is something that is key to being able to communicate. Because if not, you're just pushing a brick wall at this point.
Yeah, I think as a whole, we all have to find like better ways to just like handle our emotions, because as a man, I have been like angry enough that I like want to hit something, but like I know it's not okay to hit anyone, like let alone be like a woman, child, another man, anything. Like, but we all have to just find better ways to handle our emotions, and in situations where there is abuse, whether it be domestic, sexual, or any kind of thing, we all have to stop judging right off the bat and just kind of like assess the situation, instead of just saying like, let's point the finger and say, oh, well, this happened to you, maybe you shouldn't have wore that outfit, or this happened to you, you knew that dude was bad from the jump, you shouldn't have been with him this long. Like, stuff happens, and we don't have to always say something. We always have to point the finger. It doesn't always have to be someone's fault. It just has to be something that we need to find a solution for.
What is something that you want the people who are watching this to know? What do you want them to take away?
That this is not the end, that the abuse doesn't define you. It's just a part of your journey. And to not look at it in a regretful standpoint, but from a teachable standpoint. And it's there are solutions. It's not impossible. It's just improbable. And even if you feel stuck, there is someone or something that can help.
I think back to when I was going through what I was going through when I was young. So I had a child when I was in high school. So I speak to people who are going through that or have gone through that, and I just want people to know, like, you're not alone. You are more than your circumstance. Your life is way more valuable than what you're going through. You will get through it by any means. There's people out here that love you. There's people out here that can help you. There's resources out here that there's a bunch of resources now, and it's like, just reach out to what you, in your head, you might think, oh, this isn't going to work, or this person is not going to listen. Just do it anyways, because you never know what the outcome might be. I say do it anyways because you rather do it and something changes and you get out of that situation than you don't do it and you continue to be in that situation. You regret and you're hard on yourself because you're like, dang, I should have did it, or I should have reached out anyway. So you're not alone. I want people to know, like, to just reach out or to speak to someone if you can. If you don't feel like you can, look around on social media, Google some places, or just see what resources are in your immediate area, or even like in the proximity of where you live.
It's important to know that it's okay to talk about, like, anything. So if you have going through something, like, don't be afraid to speak about the situation, whether you speak to your best friend or a loved one, a relative, or if you actually, seek someone professionally to speak to. There's nothing wrong with that, and I want people to know it's okay to not be okay. We don't always have to be 100%, because sometimes, we just aren't. So if you feel like you need to talk to somebody, like I said, whether it's your significant other, brother, sister, cousin, mom, best friend, professional, it doesn't matter. Like, it's a carryover effect when you bottle stuff up and you leave it just trapped inside of you. So you never know how your story can help the next person get through their story. So definitely don't be afraid to speak out, to speak to someone, and it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah. I would also add that not just in speaking out, but safety planning, right? Like, I think about now when we're talking about social media, but even technology. I have family members who, when they're Ubering to my house from the airport, they can share with me where they're traveling to, and so I can track where that's at. If you're meeting someone for a date, if you're meeting someone for an exchange, because this is a partner that you're breaking up with and you're not feeling safe, meet them, say, hey, bring me my box of stuff at the police parking lot, okay? Like, we're gonna have this conversation. I'm gonna use social media, I'm gonna use technology, I'm gonna use these places of safety to protect me and mine, right? And so knowing that we can use coffee shops, we can use the Uber app, we can use these different things to help us. One of the acronyms that I use is the LB SAFE acronym. L meaning listen to what a person is saying. B, believe what they are saying, believe them. S, the stress and safety, ask them, do you feel safe in your relationship? A, afraid and abused, is this person experiencing abuse? Or are they being threatened? Or is that child being threatened or abused? And then F, friends and family, does this person have friends or family that they trust, that can keep them safe, or that they can talk to? And finally, E, can we create an emergency plan, right? For just in case of emergency, is there resources that you need, like a shelter, or a mental health professional, or a case manager to help you with things? And so using those different modalities to help us stay safe can help us ultimately break the cycle and hopefully communicate and normalize seeking out help on a difficult situation such as interpersonal violence. Interpersonal violence is something we could talk about all day. However, we are at the end of our program. I want to thank our guests, Nia, Z, and Joy, for joining us and sharing their stories. Please review the program as often as you like, because healing is a continuous process. If you're experiencing trauma or know someone who is, we'll leave you with a list of supportive resources. If you're a GSU student, please reach out to the Counseling and Wellness Center for assistance. Also, visit our website related to these topics and resources, respondtoviolence.org. Again, that's respondtoviolence.org. Thank you for joining us.